Hi everyone. Welcome back to the Human Experience Society. This is interview number 4 in our series where we are discussing the big issues and the challenging topics that humanity is facing on a daily basis. Today we are delighted to be talking with Jeremy Lent, who is an author and speaker and whose works investigate the connections between our economic, environmental, and existential crises. Having studied both in the UK and USA, Lent's publications include Patterning Instinct, released in 2017, which explores cultural history and its link to neuroscience, developing a new discipline which he calls cognitive history. Recently, Lent released another successful publication, The Web of Meaning, which presents an alternative view of how modern scientific knowledge echoes the ancient wisdom of earlier cultures. So welcome, Jeremy, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Great, yeah, thank you so much, man, Leon. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. And so here is the first question for you, Jeremy. 20 years ago, you were basically a business owner in the world of digital economy, if I'm not wrong.
Right.
So what led you to this point where you are a writer, an inspiring writer, I would say, a speaker, addressing the whole of humanity with a new way of thinking?
Yeah. Thanks for kicking off with that question, Leon. It's been an interesting journey for me because, quite honestly, 20 years ago, as you say, I was actually in the middle of the activities that right now I critique profoundly in my writing, which is helpful in a way because it gives me some insight into the psychology of people who are in this process of essentially destroying our living earth right now. But I was actually like you say, I'd got an MBA. I was a business entrepreneur. I started one of the early internet companies back in the first .com boom. And just to make it even more extreme, the company I started was actually an online credit card company that allowed people to just transfer their balances and design their own picture, so that actually I was involved in helping people to take out even more debt, to become more indebted and become even more extreme consumers. For me personally, the journey happened that at the time, my first wife, who passed away some years back, she got very sick, and I left the company to look after her. And I left the company too early, when it was in its early phase, just gone public. And within a year or two, the company actually collapsed. And then looking after my wife, she got very, not just seriously ill, but also some cognitive decline. So I kind of lost the person the one person I was really close to in my life, even though I spent years looking after her before she passed. So it felt like everything I'd built had crashed around me. And I made this determination that whatever I did with my life moving forward was to be truly meaningful. And I kind of had already felt this, what I was doing wasn't feeling meaningful. It felt successful, but not meaningful. And the question I asked is, where does meaning come from? And that's what led me to this path that led to these 2 books you described, The Patterning Instinct, which looks at the cultural history of humanity's search for meaning, because I was trying to peel the onion, if you will, for all these concepts that we take for granted, whether it's the distinction between mind and body, or humans versus nature, or what is the soul, or where is God, or whatever, all these big questions. Try to understand, where did these come from historically? And as I began to sort of piece together this history, I also got to realize how our modern worldview that I had taken for granted was leading us to this world, a world of loss of meaning, a sense of separation between who we really are and the rest of life. And so this second book that just got published recently, The Web of Meaning, the subtitle is Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe, because part of this journey for me was to actually come up with my own sense of understanding where meaning comes from, and realizing what I didn't want to do was to just have some act of faith that just gave up on science, or just believed in some guru somewhere. It had to be a form of meaning that was truly scientifically coherent, that my rational brain could buy into, but also that my heart felt was right, which a lot of reductionist science tells us is wrong. And then I began to realize that actually systems thinking in modern science leads us to the same insights, or similar insights, to what great wisdom traditions from the past have led us to, this deep interconnectedness of all life, of everything in the universe, which is what I describe in this new book.
Wow. Yeah, thank you very much for telling your briefly, of course, about your story and the big change there was in your life, and particularly hit, but what you said about the difference of being successful in life and being meaningful. That we have basically lost this difference, identifying being meaningful with being successful, but actually they are not the same thing. Thank you for highlighting that. About the next question now. In the face of such a catastrophic crisis for humanity that we are facing, I'm asking you, why are the majority of people refusing to pay attention? In my opinion, you are the perfect person to answer this kind of question, because actually you investigate both sides of the issue. The science, which says, okay, guys, we are running out of time here, but you also study these weird apes called humans, who are responding, oh, we don't care. Is it just denial in the face of pain? What is that?
Yeah, well, I think that there are two fundamental reasons why our society as a whole is not responding properly to what's going on. And they're different, but they kind of intersect too. And one has to do with, basically, you might call it human nature, or just human psychology, which is not even human psychology, but just the psychology of pretty much any evolved mammal, which is we respond to what is in front of us. And we're evolved to, if some disaster is happening, if there's a thunderstorm and trees are falling around us, our adrenaline comes up, we respond right away. And when there's a more distant problem that we have to kind of conceptualize before we even recognize it as a problem, we don't respond with our bodies in the sense of immediacy. And we see that very clearly in terms of how the COVID in the last couple of years did cause, even though there's all kinds of problems, but it caused an immediate response by governments and people around the world. As soon as it hit, pretty much, there was this massive change in people's behavior because it was a clear and present danger that people could see. Climate, environmental destruction has to be brought to people's attention. So that's one issue. That's more like, then that's just a real issue to do with human psychology. But there's another insidious and perhaps even more powerful issue, which is that the current system we have is one that the powerful interests of media, of government, of business, all the powerful interests are actually benefiting from this system. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in that regard. Those interests don't want to actually have to face the difficult issues in the short term that would cause them to have to revamp their industries, or people to have to change their profitable businesses and all that stuff. And that is something that is not to do with human psychology. That's to do with our society. Because if there's one thing that I did understand through my own research of the first book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity to Search for Meaning, is that actually what we humans do have is a patterning instinct. We have an instinct to make meaning out of the world based on what our culture tells us. So we form a worldview. And right now, this current worldview is the one that is destroying our world. And it's one that the media basically won't actually face up, because the media is just as much owned by the big corporate interests as the fossil fuel companies and all the rest of them. So somehow, and this is the big challenge, those of us who are aware of the issues have to then get enough attention to these, that these structures that be are forced to have to like come to face their realities.
Right. And about the instinct, I was also thinking, I was relating your words to a recent interview I watched released in the past, of course, from Julian Assange, who was highlighting the fact that most of people have an instinct for justice. And that's a problem with the media, that we are not allowing people to develop that instinct for justice, because we are not covering properly all of the important issues, and so they don't they can't use that instinct, they can't so it's, as you said, it's perfectly everything connected. And also you were mentioning the system, and my next question is about that. Looking at the system, at our system as a whole, well, it's clearly not working, no? And as many scientists suggest, an alternative system should be cooperative, not competitive, no?
Right, that's right.
So with this in mind, everything seems to be, sorry to be honest and clear, but everything seems to point towards socialism as a way to rebuild our society. But again, that is not happening. It's not happening all over the world. So should we wait for our policymakers to change and change themselves, and therefore our policies to change? For sure, this is the right way, but it wouldn't be quick enough, no? Should we throw the rule book out the door? Is that too radical?
Yeah, I think we simply cannot wait for those in power to make the changes, because the fact is that those in power right now in the global systems that we have are really part of the problem. They really, our system itself pushes those people who want to take power at the expense of everything else to those places of power. And they, for the most part, are corrupt, to be quite frank. They're, the distinction between business, for-profit businesses, and politics has become so blurred as to be virtually indistinguishable in virtually every country, not every country, but most countries in the world today. And as long as we just wait for politicians to wake up, they're not going to, because it's not in their short-term interests to do that. So we have to change the rule book. And I think that the thing we need to do is recognize that some of the old distinctions, really the whole last century was about the capitalism versus socialism or communism. I feel that we need to move on from that. We need to kind of leave that behind too, because quite honestly, basically the historical communist or socialist systems were also just as ready to essentially destroy the living earth for material benefit. The primary difference was, how do you cut up the pie and who gets to choose how the pie is cut up? But everyone agreed, let's just make the pie as big as possible. And we need to look at a very different world view, a very different approach that kind of leaves behind the old-fashioned right and left. And this is where I get excited by the idea of what people are increasingly talking about in terms of like an ecological civilization. To imagine what it would be like if we actually change the very basis of our civilization from one that is wealth accumulating, extractive, and exploitative to one that's actually life affirming, that's actually based on the principles that have allowed ecologies to be ecosystems, to be stable and resilient for millions of years. One that would be founded on setting the conditions for the flourishing of all humans on an actual regenerated living earth, rather than looking at humans as separate from the earth.
Right. And do you see anyone, I would say any leader or any party or any nation, at least small, I don't know, that inspires you and where you can see this starting to happen or not?
Yeah, I do. I think that there are a few, some of the smaller, sort of more enlightened nations, whether we're looking at places like Iceland or New Zealand or some of the Scandinavian countries, are actually beginning to shift. They're still coming from a capitalist system, and the leaders are not yet willing to say, okay, we got to jettison capitalism. So they're certainly not there yet, but they're starting to look in the right direction. And there are some of these countries, for example, are signatories of what's called like the Well-Being Alliance, which is an alliance that says we have to get rid of GDP, gross domestic product, as a measurement of a society's success, which really just measures how quickly the society is consuming the earth and turning human activity into the monetized system. That's all it measures. And they're coming up with new measures of actual true human well-being and life's well-being in order to see how successful we are. So at deeper levels, there are some few nations, unfortunately not the bigger ones, but some that are starting to look at what's possible. So I see it as certainly not as a hopeless situation at all, but one that we need a lot of visionary thinking, and we need to not accept false compromises that allow this destructive system to continue and just make a few incremental shifts at the margins, which don't really change where it's really going.
Okay. And yeah, absolutely agree. Refusing the compromise and being more radical is the first step, most important step. Now, coming back to your works, I can feel that with your style of writing, you leave the readers with more questions than they had before the reading, you know, and we appreciate it personally. But here is I can say, another internal fight with so many people passive in the world, passive and inactive. Should we still be encouraging them to question and waiting for them to act, or should we just, like take their hands and pull them away from the fight? It goes, it, I mean, it goes against my personal beliefs. I have compassion for these people. So should I use that compassion to educate them or to actively save them?
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting point you raise. My own sense is that what is far more important than finding the right solutions to things are finding the right questions to things. And it's really what's most essential is to ask the right question, because honestly, none of us has the definitive answer to any of these questions. And in fact, the answer comes through each individual person finding their own path, because we're only going to get to this transformation when millions of people are finding their own path towards the transformation that's needed and doing it together. But the direction that of that path comes from the question itself. So to give you an example, when people look at technology right now, the questions they might ask is like, how can we solve this particular problem as efficiently and quickly as possible? And they might have another question in the back of their head saying, oh, and how can I be the next billionaire by taking this idea and making it public and doing good, but really doing well for myself too. And so those are the questions that people ask. But what about if we change the very basis and ask this question, how could technology be in the interests of life itself? fundamentally different question. And if you start to truly ask that question and try to come up with answers, you'll come up with all kinds of different solutions to a problem. And they won't necessarily be so neat as, oh, here's the next gizmo that'll do, but they'll be more systemic and start looking at multiple fractal layers. Or another question is, how can we achieve a society that allows for fractal flourishing? Meaning that all the different fractal layers of society, from individuals to communities to whole ecosystems, that flourishing can exist at all layers rather than one outsmarting the other sort of thing, or flourishing at the expense of the other. So I feel the questions are really what are most important. And then let all kinds of creative, innovative, brilliant people come up with different answers to those questions.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, inspiring. Because I mean, it opens many challenges here. So, well, now basically we have arrived at our last question of today, one that we are always keen to ask our guests, because as humanity, we have a tendency to delay things, no? Pretending that we are planning in advance, but actually we are just hoping that the change will come from somewhere else. So here at the Human Exploring Society, we love to ask our guests this bold question. Where do you see yourself, not in 10 years, but in 1 year? What's next in your life?
Well, for me personally, where I hope to see myself a year from now is actually deep in the research and writing of my next book, in fact, which is really almost the third part of the trilogy, if you will, of these first two books that have already come. So if that first book, The Patterning Instinct, looked at the history of the different ways in which different cultures have made meaning out of the universe to the present, and this new book that's come out, The Web of Meaning, looks at this potential of a different worldview based on our deep interconnectedness that could lead to a fundamentally different future for humanity. But this book, The Web of Meaning, ends with a section that looks at what I was discussing earlier, this idea of an ecological civilization. What an ecological civilization would actually feel like, and what are some of the specifics that we could see in real tangible terms of that ecological civilization. So the next book I plan to write is going to be on the topic of an ecological civilization. Probably call it something like Future Flourishing, Pathways to an Ecological Civilization. And looking at really what would it actually look and feel like to live in that civilization? How would industry look? How would business look? How would technology look? How would our communities look, and education? The whole thing, because the thing is, these are not my ideas. All the ideas for an ecological civilization are already there in millions of brilliant original thinkers around the world coming up, forging pathways toward a life-affirming future. So just like I've done in the other books, what I intend to do in this book is not so much come up with my own vision of something, but actually show what others are already doing and weave together so that people can see that there is a path that's possible. That we don't, you know, that famous quote, it's easier for most people to imagine the end of humanity, the end of the world, than it is the end of capitalism, because it's so difficult for us to imagine a different future. So my plan with this next book is to show that different future is right there available for us. All we need is the global political will to move in that direction.
Wow. So there are some exclusive news coming from you today about your future. So thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you for this opportunity. It has been a great pleasure to talk with you. And thanks to our audience for tuning in today. So please follow us on our channels to find out more, and see you next time. Thank you, Jeremy. Bye.
And thank you, Manuel. Great conversation. Thank you.